Ah yes, the Borderlands, the land of borders, where barriers actually don't feel like they exist because a lot of the world is fucking unhinged, but not in that I'm in danger kind of way. More like in the way that you drank 4 2-liters of Pepsi and ate a ton of rope licorice with your fellow 13-year-old friends on a Friday night because you are all wilding out. Fart humor, poop humor, fart and poop humor, and a lot of other juvenile jokes that never really clicked with me. Ah, Borderlands. I know ye not so well. Tiny Tina's Wonderland is actually my first trek into a Borderlands adjacent universe outside of a couple of hours of Borderlands 1 and 2 many years ago. And you're now probably saying, well, Skin Teen, how can you possibly have an opinion about this game then? And for that, I say 2 things. 1, I played this game for 9 hours almost nonstop last night. 9. It's excessive when I forget to use the restroom until my chat starts debating what happens to you if you don't pee for an entire day, but also, number 2, to quote the great poets of the mid-90s, Salt and Peppa, opinions are like assholes, and everybody's got one. And here's mine. Tiny Tina's Wonderlands is a full-featured spin-off of a Borderlands 2 DLC that was widely popular amongst the core fan base, and naturally was begging for more attention. I, of course, am relatively brand new to this franchise, so I only knew that the humor of Borderlands, the original, kinda grew tiresome for me, and for that reason, along with like a massive backlog that I've constantly tried to address over the course of many years, I just didn't really go there with Borderlands. But I'm glad I did here because what Tiny Tina and her Wonderlands had to offer was a delightful trek into the playful yet slightly warped mind of its namesake, replete with goblins, ghouls, trolls, and all kinds of shit that you get in a fantasy tabletop RPG that wishes to remain nameless. In a video game landscape that is lately saturated with so many rich open worlds that feel almost daunting and laborious to dive into. What do you mean there's 500 hours of completionist content in Dying Light 2? Elden Ring has an underside to the map? Oh, what the fuck? Tiny Tina's Wonderlands is, honestly, yet another one of those kinds of games to add to the list. It seems like the game packs a lot of content, like a lot of content, into its borders. Borderlands. Into its formula. There we go. There's a lot of content here. In the 9 hours that I spent streaming this game, I would say that 2 to 3 of those hours were spent on the same quest chain that takes place pretty early on, and it's a side quest that you're recommended to take in order to level up. And honestly, it was a welcome distraction. Like its predecessor games, Tiny Tina's Wonderlands is what most would call Diablo with guns. And by that, I mean you're gonna get loot. You're gonna get a lot of loot. Your loot's gonna get loot. You're gonna have so much loot that you're not gonna be sure how to handle it. You'll eventually stop picking up the grays, and then the greens, and then pretty early on you're gonna become a loot snob and only pick up the purples and the blues. You're holding out for the orange, but guess what? You're still gonna be so steamrolled by all the loot this game has to offer that the only way that you're gonna be able to handle it is to blow a raspberry into the sky, suck it up, Buttercup, and keep on grinding. Tiny Tina's tabletop RPG experience laid out in video game format is delightful in that the humor isn't so shoved down your throat that it's tiresome, at least for me. And the color palette isn't just brown on orange on more brown, and that your eyes, they don't get so fatigued from looking at it. Tiny Tina's Wonderlands is a visual feast, one that you're gonna want to continue cashing in your all-you-can-eat card to visit. I played this game on the most casual of difficulties, because of course I did. And again, I cannot understate how I only intended to play this for a couple of hours, but 9 of those hours just flew by like it was nothing. 9! And because I was having a genuinely good time playing Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, and I lost track of what the hours were. I bring up this difficulty because I cannot speak to higher tier difficulties or measure that up to previous Borderlands experiences. Again, this was my first true venture into a Borderlands outside of a couple of brushes with it in the past. Now, I am no stranger to shooters, however, and I love a good fast-paced shoot first and ask questions later experience. Listen.
In the first age, in the first battle, when the shadows first lengthened, one stood.
And it was me, playing Doom 2 Hell on Earth in my room at the tender age of 11. I grew up on these kinds of games, and I would actually love nothing more than to possibly go back and finally check out Borderlands as a franchise now that I've had some time with Tiny Tina. But honestly, I think Tiny Tina's Wonderlands feels like it's gonna give me everything I need without having to go back and play those earlier games. So I would say that newcomers of the franchise who feel similarly about FPS games might be interested in checking out this quirky ride, and they might actually feel like going back and playing the games like me too. Will Borderlands fans like it? Most likely. The consensus that I was gathering from my chat during the live stream was that this was a beloved character and a beloved idea barely explored from previous Borderlands games, and that this fleshes that out and other things that already existed and were loved in a very positive way. The gameplay itself doesn't appear to stray too far from what is already familiar to fans of the series, and if anything, some of what Tiny Tina's Wonderlands has to offer brings a slightly more immersive experience to the table from the standard looter shooter. I mean, character creation alone is fantastic. I created Whoa Black Betty, and I love her with every fiber of my being. From her himbo backstory to her luscious and flowing hair, she's a character that I want to see through Tiny Tina's Wonderlands until the end. Tiny Tina's Wonderland is like any other Borderlands game in that ideally I think you're supposed to play these with a couple of friends, but as the solo lone wolf rebel I am, Dottie, I played this alone. And I gotta say, it's just as enjoyable flying by your lonesome as it is with a group of friends, I would imagine. Sad violence. And again, I can't understate the amount of content here that there is to dive into. And while a lot of it does feel kind of same-ish at times, in that it manages to follow some of the same wash, rinse, repeat formula that you might know from previous Borderlands games, or games that are of this kind of genre, you know the ones, with the preset maps, the encounters that you have thresholds to meet, wondrous loot that you have to farm to get the god-tier gear that you need for the dopamine hit that you're searching for. Sorry, I got kind of carried away there. I don't think the random encounters, dungeons, and mini-dungeons feeling kind of same-ish is really a problem at the end of the day. In fact, it feels kind of cozy to me. Which leads me to my last little thought about my time with Tiny Tina's Wonderlands. I think the only other thing that I could possibly say about this game in terms of whether or not I think it's worth it is that it scratches a very deep itch that I've been desperately trying to reach in terms of a game that has a similar loot table to something like Diablo or Path of Exile. Seriously, grindy loot games are a zen experience to some, and I am that some. I love a good isometric ARPG, and this definitely goes there in a way that I wasn't expecting. The grind is definitely real, and that's something I felt in the last hour or so of the stream when the pacing of the fight started to become like the longest mile that I was never gonna finish climbing. But that's not an unpleasant or unwelcome sensation to have to endure. The gameplay loop seems like, from all appearances, your standard Borderlands experience, albeit maybe with some slightly more whimsical takes on classes and abilities. I, for one, welcome this fusion of styles fully with arms outstretched, because there's something about the way that Tiny Tina's Wonderlands feels that hits just right for me. From the overworld map to the chance encounters to the dialogue that's familiar to Borderlands yet toned down and balanced out, at least in my opinion. Hell, simply down to the colorful landscape that you're set in, Tiny Tina's Wonderlands has made me a fan. Tiny Tina's Wonderlands is currently available on the Epic Games Store as well as PlayStation and Xbox. No word yet on when Steam's gonna do the release date, but, you know, whatever. Check out the link below if you want to check it out on the Epic Games Store and support the channel. Thanks.